London, May 1814. The chandeliers of Almack's assembly rooms cast golden light across polished floors, illuminating silk gowns and perfectly tailored evening attire. In the corner near the refreshment tables, Miss Georgiana Elizabeth Darlington stood with posture that suggested neither apology nor invitation, her amber eyes fixed on Lady Jersey with an intensity that made several nearby guests pause their conversations to listen. "You cannot seriously suggest, Lady Jersey, that women possess inferior intellect simply because the law denies us property rights," Georgiana said, her voice carrying the refined accent of Mayfair, but with an edge that made it clear she would not be dismissed. At 24, she had perfected the art of speaking her convictions without raising her voice. Lady Jersey's fan snapped open with practiced precision. "My dear Miss Darlington, intellect has nothing to do with natural order. Women are protected by marriage, guided by masculine wisdom. Why would we wish for the burden of managing estates or traveling without proper escort?" "Protection," Georgiana repeated, the word carrying weight. "An interesting term for what the law calls coverture, where a woman's very existence becomes absorbed into her husband's upon marriage. I do not suggest all women must remain unmarried, only that marriage should not be our sole avenue to security or respect. Why can a widow manage an estate after her husband's death, but an unmarried woman of the same age and breeding cannot? If stories of women who dared to demand more than society allowed touch your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey through love, courage, and transformation. You will not want to miss what happens next." The whispers began immediately, rippling outward through the assembly room like stones dropped in still water. Miss Darlington had done it again. 3 seasons, 6 refused proposals, and she showed no signs of moderating her scandalous opinions about female independence. "Someone should warn the poor girl," Mrs. Henrietta Blackwell murmured behind her fan to her companion. "At her age, with such views, she'll find herself a spinster caring for elderly relatives." "Her father indulges her terribly," came the reply. "Lord Richard allows her to read philosophy, attend lectures. What does she expect will come of filling her head with such notions?" But Georgiana heard none of this, focused as she was on making her point to Lady Jersey. "I do not suggest all women must remain unmarried, only that marriage should not be our sole avenue to security or respect. Why can a widow manage an estate after her husband's death, but an unmarried woman of the same age and breeding cannot?" "Because," Lady Jersey said, with the finality of one accustomed to being the authority on all matters social, "it is simply not the way of our world, Miss Darlington. That is sufficient reason." "An excellent reason," a male voice said from behind Georgiana, rich with amusement. "I find because it is not done to be the foundation of all the best arguments." Georgiana turned, prepared to face yet another gentleman ready to mock her convictions or, worse, to pretend agreement in hopes of softening her resistance to courtship. Instead, she found herself looking up at a cavalry officer in immaculate regimentals, his blonde hair tied back in the military fashion, revealing a face that managed to combine aristocratic features with something harder, earned rather than inherited. Captain Edmund Arthur Fairmont stood at considerable height, his blue eyes holding an expression that Georgiana could not immediately categorize. He was not smirking, as so many young men did when they encountered her debates. Nor was he wearing the indulgent expression of those who found female intellect charming in the way one might find a performing dog charming. He was, she realized with surprise, genuinely interested. "Captain Fairmont," Lady Jersey said, her tone warming considerably. "How delightful to see you. I trust your regiment is well prepared for the Continental campaign?" "As prepared as any regiment can be for war, Lady Jersey," Edmund replied, but his eyes remained on Georgiana. "Though I confess, the debates at Almack's seem nearly as fierce as any military engagement." "Miss Darlington was just sharing her views on marriage," Lady Jersey said with meaningful emphasis. "Quite passionate views, as I am sure you heard." "I did," Edmund said. I found them remarkably well-reasoned, actually. My own mother managed our family estate for 15 years after my father's death, and I can attest that female intellect is more than equal to the task when given opportunity. The silence that followed this statement was profound. Georgiana studied the captain with new attention. Men did not typically speak of women's capabilities in mixed company, certainly not in defense of such capabilities. She searched his expression for signs of performance, for the calculated charm of a libertine whose intentions are purely for sport, cloaked by an air of novelty. She found none. "Captain Fairmont," she said carefully, "you are either the most progressive gentleman in London, or you are employing a remarkably sophisticated strategy of courtship." His smile reached his eyes. "I assure you, Miss Darlington, I am far too honest a soldier to be skilled at sophisticated strategies. My mother would box my ears if I suggested women needed masculine guidance to think clearly. She raised 4 sons while managing 3 properties, and did both rather well." "Then your mother is extraordinary," Georgiana replied. "No more extraordinary than any woman given actual opportunity," Edmund said, "which I believe was your point to Lady Jersey." Lady Jersey made a sound that might have been a cough or might have been suppressed outrage. "Captain, surely you do not truly believe that women should travel alone or manage finances without male oversight?" "I believe, Lady Jersey, that women should have the same freedoms as their brothers," stated Edmund, his tone level, thereby lending the radical assertion the unquestionable quality of fact. "My sister Carolyn travels to visit our aunt in Bath without male escort, and I can assure you the world has not ended." Georgiana felt a sudden, unwelcome awareness of hope. For 6 years, since her presentation at court at 18, she had defended her convictions to a society that viewed her as either pitiable or dangerous. She had watched friends marry, had endured her father's gentle suggestions that perhaps she might moderate her views, had stood firm against the tide of opinion that insisted a woman's highest calling was obedient matrimony. And here stood a cavalry officer who spoke of female capability as though it were obvious truth rather than controversial philosophy. "I wonder, Miss Darlington," Edmund said, "if you might grant me the honor of the next dance? I find I would very much like to hear more of your views on inheritance law and property rights." Several gasps followed this request. Gentlemen did not ask to dance with Miss Darlington after hearing her speak on such topics. They excused themselves, or they attempted to change the subject to something more properly feminine. Georgiana met his gaze directly. "You wish to debate legal philosophy during a dance, Captain?" "I wish to understand the reasoning of someone who thinks deeply about justice," Edmund replied. "The dance merely provides a socially acceptable framework for such conversation." "Then I accept," Georgiana said, placing her gloved hand in his. As they moved toward the dance floor, she heard Mrs. Blackwell's scandalized whisper, "He must not know about her reputation for refusing proposals. Poor man." But Georgiana suspected Captain Edmund Fairmont knew exactly what he was doing, and that realization was both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. The dance was a cotillion, which provided intervals of conversation between the figures. As they moved through the first pattern, Edmund spoke with the ease of someone accustomed to making quick assessments on the battlefield. "How many proposals have you refused, Miss Darlington? The gossip varies from 3 to 12. Georgiana appreciated his directness. "6, Captain. All from gentlemen who desired either my father's connections or an obedient ornament for their drawing rooms." "And you preferred independence to security," Edmund said as they turned. "That requires considerable courage." "Or considerable stubbornness," Georgiana replied. "Society cannot quite decide which." "Perhaps both," Edmund suggested. "The best convictions usually require both courage and stubbornness to maintain." They separated for the next figure, and Georgiana found herself watching him as he moved through the patterns with other dancers. He carried himself with the controlled grace of a man trained for combat, but there was nothing harsh in his manner. When he returned to her, his expression held a quality she rarely encountered in ballrooms: respect. "Tell me, Miss Darlington," Edmund said as they joined hands for a turn, "what is it you truly want? If the world were constructed to your preference, what would your life look like?" The question caught her unprepared. Most people argued with her conclusions, but never inquired about her desires. "I want," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "to be consulted about my own future, to inherit a portion of my father's estate as my brothers will, to travel without needing male permission or escort, to manage my own finances, read what I choose, attend lectures that interest me." She paused, then added with complete honesty, "I want to be treated as a person of sense rather than a decorative problem requiring a masculine solution." "All reasonable desires," Edmund said, his tone entirely serious, "and none incompatible with happiness or even with marriage, should the marriage be founded on respect rather than possession." Georgiana stumbled slightly, and his hand steadied her. "You speak of marriage that would preserve female autonomy. I was not aware such marriages existed outside of philosophy texts." "They are rare," Edmund admitted. "But rare does not mean impossible. My parents had such a marriage. My father valued my mother's judgment, consulted her on all major decisions, ensured she had independent income." His expression grew distant. "When he died, she grieved him deeply, not because she had lost her protector, but because she had lost her partner. The dance required them to separate again, and Georgiana used the interval to steady herself. This conversation was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with scandal or reputation. Captain Fairmont spoke of possibilities she had convinced herself did not exist, of a marriage that might be partnership rather than surrender. When they came together for the final figures, Edmund's voice was quieter. "I deploy to the continent in 3 months, Miss Darlington. The campaign against Napoleon requires every available officer. I do not know when I will return or if I will return." "Then why seek my acquaintance?" Georgiana asked, genuine confusion in her voice. "If you leave so soon?" "Because," Edmund said, meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch, "I heard you speak tonight and thought, there is someone who understands that life is too short for comfortable lies. And because I am weary of the pretense that true courage is only found beneath the smoke of cannon fire." The dance ended. Edmund bowed, Georgiana curtsied, and she knew with absolute certainty that her carefully constructed independence had just encountered its first genuine threat. Not from a man who sought to diminish her, but from one who saw her clearly and was not afraid of what he saw. The following weeks brought a courtship unlike any Georgiana had experienced during her 6 seasons. Captain Fairmont called at appropriate hours, always properly accompanied by his younger brother, Lieutenant James Fairmont. But the conversations that filled those morning calls had nothing to do with weather or fashion. They discussed philosophy. Edmund brought her a copy of Mary Wollstonecraft's work that his mother had treasured, and they spent an entire afternoon debating the rights of women with Georgiana's father, listening in bemused approval from his chair by the fire. Lord Richard Darlington, having borne witness to his daughter's refusal of 6 proposals, observed with a mixture of concern and pride, but he could not help noting that Captain Fairmont engaged her intellect rather than trying to suppress it. They attended lectures together, properly chaperoned by Georgiana's companion, Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, a widow who had known Georgiana since childhood and who spent most of these outings reading novels in the back of lecture halls, while Georgiana and Edmund debated the speaker's points afterward. "You disagree with the premise entirely," Edmund said as they walked through the British Museum one afternoon in late June, examining the Elgin marbles while Mrs. Fletcher maintained discreet distance. "I can see it in your expression." The lecturer suggested that classical Greek democracy represented ideal governance, Georgiana replied, studying the carved figures with critical attention. "But Greek democracy extended rights only to male citizens, not to women, not to slaves, not to foreigners. How can we call a system ideal when it excludes the majority of humanity?" Edmund was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the marble figures. You are right, of course. We build pedestals for partial justice and call it perfection. History is written by those who hold power, Georgiana said, and those who hold power naturally conclude that the distribution of power is just. Which is why, Edmund said, turning to face her, voices like yours matter. You question what others accept. You see the walls that have become invisible to the comfortable. Georgiana felt her cheeks warm, not from embarrassment, but from the recognition in his words. Most people find my questions tedious or threatening. Most people, Edmund replied, are afraid of questions that might require them to change. They moved to the next gallery, their footsteps echoing on marble floors. Mrs. Fletcher followed at her customary distance, absorbed in her novel. Tell me about your deployment, Georgiana said, changing the subject to something she could not quite bring herself to avoid any longer. When exactly do you leave? August 15th, Edmund replied. 3 more weeks. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. 3 weeks. It seemed simultaneously like forever, and like no time at all. And the campaign? Georgiana pressed, needing to understand what he would face. Napoleon is contained, but not defeated, Edmund said, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone accustomed to military realities. The coalition is fragile. We will face battle, probably multiple engagements. The cavalry will be crucial for reconnaissance and for the shock of the charge when it comes to full engagement. Georgiana's hands tightened on her reticule. You speak of it so calmly. Fear serves no purpose, Edmund said. I am a soldier, Miss Darlington. This is what I was trained to do, but I will not lie to you about the risks. I appreciate your honesty, Georgiana said quietly, though I confess I am not certain what to do with it. Edmund stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The museum gallery was empty except for Mrs. Fletcher at the far end, and for a moment they existed in a space separate from the world's expectations. Georgiana, Edmund said, using her Christian name for the first time, his voice low enough that it would not carry. I want to be entirely clear about my intentions, because I respect you too much for ambiguity. I am falling in love with you. Not with some softened version you might perform for my benefit, but with exactly who you are, convictions and all. Georgiana's breath caught. She had heard declarations before, flowery speeches designed to overcome her resistance. This was different. This was truth offered without decoration, without strategy. I know you value your independence, Edmund continued. I know you have refused marriage because you feared it would require you to become less than yourself. I cannot promise you that war will spare me. I cannot promise you a future because no soldier can. But I can promise you this. If I survive, if I return, I will spend my life proving that marriage can be partnership, that you can be fully yourself and fully loved. Edmund, Georgiana whispered, his name strange and wonderful on her lips. My life was built upon the denial of this very yearning. I know not how to permit myself such a desire. Then do not decide now, Edmund said gently. Wait, see what you feel when I am gone. If you find relief in my absence, then you have your answer. But if you find yourself wishing for my return, then perhaps consider that independence and love need not be enemies. And if you do not return? Georgiana forced herself to ask the question that terrified her. Edmund's expression softened. Then you will grieve, and you will continue. You are far too strong to be destroyed by loss, even if loss breaks your heart. It was, Georgiana thought, the most earnest declaration she had ever received, and consequently, the most unsettling. And it was exactly what she needed to hear. The remaining weeks passed in a strange suspension between joy and dread. Georgiana and Edmund spent every acceptable moment together, their conversations ranging from political philosophy to poetry, from estate management to military strategy. He treated her mind as worth engaging, her opinions as worth considering, her convictions as worth respecting. And somewhere in those conversations, Georgiana felt the precise, careful architecture of her self-sufficiency begin to yield. They rode together in Hyde Park during the promenade hour, properly attended by grooms, but often riding ahead of the more sedately paced carriages, allowing for conversation free from immediate oversight. They attended the theater, where they whispered critiques of the performance between acts. They dined at her father's house, where Edmund charmed Lord Richard by asking intelligent questions about estate management and then deferring to Georgiana when she offered opinions. "He is good for you," Lord Richard told his daughter one evening after Edmund had departed. "I have watched you shine these past weeks in ways I have not seen since you were a child, before society taught you that brightness must be dimmed." "He leaves in 5 days," Georgiana replied, the reality settling over her like frost. "I know," her father said gently, "but even 5 days of genuine connection is worth more than a lifetime of comfortable compromise." The night before Edmund's deployment, he requested permission to call upon Georgiana for a private farewell. It was highly irregular, but Lord Richard granted permission with the understanding that Mrs. Fletcher would be present and that the farewell would take place in the garden, visible from the house. The August evening was warm, the air heavy with the scent of roses from Georgiana's mother's garden. Lady Sarah Darlington had died 6 years earlier, but her roses still bloomed with determined beauty, climbing the walls and filling the air with perfume. Georgiana stood by the fountain, her pale green gown catching the last light of sunset. She heard Edmund's footsteps on the gravel path and turned to face him, her heart pounding with emotions she could not name. He was in uniform, his sword at his side, his hair tied back with military precision. But his expression was entirely unguarded, showing everything he felt without shame or strategy. "Georgiana," he said, stopping a proper distance away. "Mrs." Fletcher had positioned herself near the garden gate, close enough to serve as chaperone but far enough to grant them privacy for quiet conversation. "Thank you for seeing me." "Of course," Georgiana replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I could not let you leave without saying farewell." Edmund closed the distance between them, and Georgiana felt the evening air grow charged with everything unspoken between them. For weeks, they had maintained proper decorum, had followed society's rules for courtship, had been so careful. But he was leaving tomorrow for war, and careful suddenly seemed like a waste of whatever time they had. "I have something for you," Edmund said, reaching into his coat. He withdrew a sealed letter. "I wrote this last night. It contains things I may not have the courage to say aloud, things I want you to know regardless of what happens. Promise me you will read it only after I have gone." Georgiana took the letter with trembling hands. "Edmund, Let me finish," Edmund said gently. "Please, because if I do not say this now, I may lose my nerve entirely." He took a breath, his blue eyes never leaving hers. "I love you, Georgiana Elizabeth Darlington. I love your brilliant mind and your fierce convictions. I love that you refuse to be diminished. I love that you see injustice and speak against it, even when silence would be safer. If I survive this campaign, I will return and ask for your hand in a marriage of true partnership. But regardless of your answer, I need you to know that you have fundamentally changed how I see the world." Tears pricked Georgiana's eyes. "You have changed how I see it as well. I spent years convinced that love meant surrender, that any man who desired me must wish to diminish me. You showed me I was wrong. Then will you do something for me?" Edmund asked, his voice low and urgent. "Will you consider, truly consider, that when I return, we might build something new together? Not the marriage society expects, but the marriage we choose?" "Yes," Georgiana whispered. "Yes, I will consider it. More than consider it. Edmund, I am terrified, but I think I might already love you, and I do not know what to do with that." Edmund's expression transformed with joy and longing. "May I kiss you, just once, to carry the memory with me?" Georgiana glanced toward Mrs. Fletcher, who had very deliberately turned her back and was studying the roses with intense concentration. The impropriety of it was immense. An unmarried woman permitting such intimacy could destroy her reputation if it became known. But Edmund was leaving tomorrow for war, and Georgiana was tired of living her entire life according to rules made by people who did not care about her happiness. "Yes," she said. Edmund stepped closer, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with infinite gentleness. "I have longed for this, Georgiana, since the moment I first witnessed your passion debating Lady Jersey," he murmured. "You were magnificent in your conviction, and I was lost." Then he kissed her, and Georgiana felt everything she had been protecting herself against crash through her defenses. His mouth pressed against hers, warm and sure, the kiss deepening as she responded, her hands gripping his shoulders. She could feel his heart pounding against her palm, could taste the desperation in the way he held her as though she were the only solid thing in a world tilting toward chaos. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Edmund rested his forehead against hers. "Promise me," he said urgently. "Promise me you will not spend your life waiting. If I do not return, if the worst happens, you must continue living fully. Your convictions, your strength, they are too important to waste in grief." "Do not speak of not returning," Georgiana said fiercely. "You will survive, and you will come back, and we will have our chance." "From your lips to God's ears," Edmund said with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "But promise me anyway." "I promise," Georgiana said, though the words felt like betrayal. "But you promise me you will fight to survive, that you will not take unnecessary risks." "I promise to do everything in my power to return to you," Edmund said solemnly. "And when I do, I will court you all over again, properly, until you are absolutely certain." They stood in the garden as twilight deepened to night, holding each other as though they could stop time through will alone. Mrs. Fletcher continued her examination of roses, granting them these stolen moments. Eventually, inevitably, Edmund had to leave. He kissed Georgiana once more, quickly, fiercely, then stepped back. "Read the letter tomorrow," he said, "after I am gone." "Be safe," Georgiana whispered. "Come back to me." "I will spend every day trying," Edmund replied. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps on the gravel path growing fainter until the night swallowed him entirely. Georgiana remained in the garden long after he left, the sealed letter clutched to her chest, breathing in the scent of her mother's roses and trying to memorize every detail of the evening, knowing that memory would have to sustain her through months of uncertainty. But something had shifted in that garden, something irrevocable. When Edmund touched her, when he kissed her, her careful control had slipped. The connection between them had deepened beyond simple affection, beyond the intellectual partnership she had valued. It had become something deeply instinctive, an ardor that defied the rational framework she had always maintained. What Georgiana did not know, could not know in that moment, was that the kiss in the garden would have consequences far beyond emotional attachment. She would be carrying Edmund's child. The autumn of 1814 passed in a haze of denial and growing panic. Georgiana read Edmund's letter the morning after his departure, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed his words. He wrote of his love, of his vision for their future together, of his promise to return and court her properly. He wrote of property he owned, separate from his military career, that he wanted her to manage as she saw fit if they married. He wrote of a partnership where her voice would be equal to his in all decisions. He wrote of a future that Georgiana desperately wanted and increasingly feared she would never see. The first suspicion came in September when the patterns of her body that had been reliable since girlhood failed to appear. Georgiana told herself it was stress, that worry about Edmund's safety had disrupted her natural rhythms. She wrote to him, carefully worded letters that maintained propriety while conveying her feelings, sending them to the military address he had provided. But the letters that came back were from fellow officers, brief notes saying Captain Fairmont was deployed to forward positions and correspondence was delayed. The words were polite and gave no real information, and Georgiana felt dread growing in her chest like a living thing. By October, she could no longer deny reality. Her body was changing in ways that could not be attributed to worry or grief. Nausea plagued her mornings. Her gowns grew tight across her middle, and with each passing day, the terrible understanding settled more firmly into her mind. She was pregnant, unmarried, with a child conceived out of wedlock, with a man who was fighting on the continent and might never return. The scandal, when it became known, would destroy her. And more than that, it would destroy her child. A bastard, marked from birth by the circumstances of conception, denied inheritance, denied legitimacy, denied everything society believed children were owed by virtue of birth within sanctioned marriage. Georgiana spent October in a state of suppressed terror, telling no one, wearing looser gowns, praying desperately for news from Edmund. She wrote more urgent letters, hinting at circumstances that required his immediate return, but the military post was chaotic, and she had no way of knowing if he received them. Then, in early November, a letter arrived from the War Office. The War Office seal was cold and red upon the thick paper, the handwriting official, impersonal, and Georgiana's hands shook so badly that Mrs. Fletcher had to steady her as she broke the seal. Captain Edmund Arthur Fairmont was listed as missing, presumed dead, following a cavalry engagement near the French border. His horse had been found, bloodied but riderless. Several members of his regiment confirmed seeing him fall during the fighting, but no body had been recovered. The War Office regretted to inform his family that unless evidence to the contrary emerged, Captain Fairmont would be officially declared deceased in 30 days. Georgiana read the letter 3 times, the words refusing to make sense. Missing, presumed dead, no body recovered. She fainted, and when she woke, she was in her bed with her father sitting beside her, his face carved with worry, and Mrs. Fletcher wringing her hands in the corner. "Georgiana," Lord Richard said gently, "Dorothy told me about the letter. I am so very sorry, my dear." For a moment, Georgiana thought he meant only the letter from the War Office. Then she saw Mrs. Fletcher's expression, saw the combination of concern and knowledge, and understood that her longtime companion had noticed what Georgiana had tried to hide. "How long have you known?" Georgiana asked, her voice raw. "Since last week," Mrs. Fletcher admitted. "I have raised 4 children of my own, dear girl. I know the signs, but I thought you should be the one to tell your father when you were ready." Lord Richard's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on a resolute sternness that settled into his features, indicating his course of action. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly. "The truth, Georgiana. All of it." So she told him. The courtship, the growing love, the farewell in the garden. The single night of intimacy born of love and impending separation. The terrible realization that had followed. And then the devastating letter from the War Office. "I thought we would have time," Georgiana whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He was going to return, and we were going to marry, and it would have been unconventional but not scandalous. But now he is gone, and our child will bear the consequences of our moment of weakness." Lord Richard was quiet for a long time, his hand covering hers. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of difficult decisions. "You cannot remain in London. The moment your condition becomes obvious, the scandal will be immediate and merciless. They will call you ruined, call your child a bastard, and no amount of my influence will protect either of you from society's judgment." "I know," Georgiana said, the words bitter as ash. "I have spent years defending female autonomy, and here I am, destroyed by the one moment I followed my heart instead of my principles." "No," Lord Richard said firmly. "You are not destroyed, and you will not speak of yourself that way. You made a choice to love someone worthy of your love. The circumstances are tragic, but your choice was not shameful." He stood, pacing the room as he thought. "The world punishes a woman's honesty, Georgiana. Only the protective shield of a deceased heroic husband can save you both from complete ruin. Hartfield Manor, he said finally. The estate in the Lake District. It is remote, far from London society, with only the village nearby. You will go there, ostensibly for your health, the isolation and fresh air. Mrs. Fletcher will accompany you as companion and help. The staff there are loyal to our family and will be discreet. And when the child is born? Georgiana asked, forcing herself to confront the full reality. A woman appearing with an infant she cannot claim as legitimate? We will tell the village you are a widow, Lord Richard said. Captain Fairmont's death gives us that much. You were secretly married before he deployed, and now you mourn your husband and carry his child. It is not the truth, but it is believable enough to protect you both. A lie, Georgiana said flatly, built on a foundation of more lies. A mercy, Lord Richard corrected gently, built on the foundation of a father's love for his daughter and unborn grandchild. Let me give you this, Georgiana. Let me protect you the only way I can. Georgiana closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her situation press down like physical force. Everything she had fought for, every principle she had defended, felt hollow in the face of pregnancy outside marriage. She had wanted independence, had insisted women should have the same freedoms as men, had refused to be bound by society's expectations. But society's consequences fell far more heavily on women than men, and all the philosophical arguments in the world would not protect her child from being labeled a bastard. When do I leave? She asked, opening her eyes to meet her father's gaze. Within the week, Lord Richard replied, before anyone beyond Mrs. Fletcher notices your condition. I will handle the explanations to society. Tell them you require rest and have gone to the country for your health. They will gossip anyway, Georgiana said. Let them gossip about illness and nerves, her father replied. Better that than truth. So Georgiana Elizabeth Darlington, who had refused 6 proposals in 3 seasons, who had defended female independence in the most exclusive drawing rooms of London, who had debated property rights with Lady Jersey herself, left the city in shame. She traveled north with Mrs. Fletcher, carrying Edmund's child and the shattered pieces of everything she had believed about her own strength. Hartfield Manor rested in the Cumberland Hills overlooking Derwentwater, a solid stone structure built by Georgiana's grandfather in a moment of architectural ambition. It was beautiful in a remote, austere way, with gardens that ran down to the lake's edge and mountains rising beyond in layers of slate and green. It was also achingly lonely. Georgiana spent the winter of 1814 into 1815 in a state of suspended grief. She was not technically a widow, having never been married, but she wore black anyway. The villagers accepted the fiction of secret marriage with the generous sympathy rural communities often showed toward gentry in difficulty. The local doctor, an elderly man named Thomas Weatherby, asked no uncomfortable questions when Lord Richard sent word of his daughter's delicate condition. She read Edmund's letter until the paper threatened to disintegrate from handling. She walked the gardens and the hills when her growing body permitted. She waited for news that never came. The War Office sent one more letter in December, confirming that no trace of Captain Fairmont had been found, and he was now officially listed as deceased. Georgiana placed that letter in a box with the one he had given her the night before his departure, and tried to learn how to breathe around the constant ache in her chest. You must think of the child, Mrs. Fletcher said gently one February afternoon as Georgiana stood by the window, watching snow fall over the lake. You must find strength for the baby, even if you cannot find it for yourself. I am trying, Georgiana said quietly. But I loved him, Dorothy. I did not think I could love anyone, and then he appeared and understood me, and now he is gone, and I am left with this impossible situation. Love is never impossible, Mrs. Fletcher replied. Difficult, yes. Tragic sometimes, but not impossible. And the child you carry is proof that love existed, even if briefly. In March, another letter arrived from the War Office, this one final and bureaucratic. Captain Edmund Arthur Fairmont was confirmed dead. His property would pass to his younger brother James. His effects had been sent to his family. The matter was closed. Georgiana read the letter in her bedroom, then folded it carefully and added it to the box. 3 letters now. Edmund's profession of love, the first notice of his disappearance, the final declaration of death. A week later, on a stormy night in late March 1815, Georgiana went into labor. Dr. Weatherby was summoned, and Mrs. Fletcher stayed by her side through the long hours of pain and fear. The storm outside matched the storm of Georgiana's body, thunder rolling across the lake as she fought to bring Edmund's child into a world that would judge them both for the circumstances of conception. As dawn broke over the mountains, Georgiana's son was born. He had blonde hair like his father, already visible in the downy wisps that covered his small head. His eyes, when they opened, were the same impossible blue. "Edmund," Georgiana whispered, holding her son for the first time. "Edmund James, for your father and his brother." The baby looked up at her with eyes that already seemed to see too much, and Georgiana felt something crack open in her chest. Love, fierce and protective, far stronger than anything she had felt even for Edmund himself. "I will protect you," she promised her son. "Whatever the cost, whatever the sacrifice, I will protect you from a world that would judge you for my choices." She named him Edmund James Fairmont, claiming her lie as widow completely. The villagers cooed over the baby when Mrs. Fletcher carried him to be christened. Gifts arrived, simple things from families with little to spare but generous hearts. And Georgiana settled into a life she had never imagined, alone with her son in a beautiful prison of society's making. The seasons turned slowly over Hartfield Manor, marked by Georgiana's resolute existence. Georgiana raised Edmund with a fierce determination to give him everything his father would have wanted for him. She taught him to read from the philosophy books Edmund Sr. had given her. She walked with him through the gardens, telling him stories of his father's courage and honor. She never lied about the love between his parents, only about the legal status of that love. Edmund James, all gilded hair and unnervingly bright blue eyes, possessed his father's height and his mother's serious demeanor. He was clever and curious, asking endless questions about the world beyond their small corner of Cumberland. But Georgiana lived in a state of permanent mourning. She wore black or dark gray. She attended church, but declined other social engagements. She read and walked and raised her son, and tried not to think about the future she had lost in a cavalry charge somewhere on the continent. Lord Richard visited twice a year, bringing news from London that Georgiana barely cared about anymore. Her former friends had married, had children, had scandals and triumphs. Miss Darlington, who had once been so scandalous for her opinions, was now forgotten, remembered only as the girl who had gone to the country and never returned. "You could come back," her father said during his visit in the summer of 1818. "Enough time has passed. You are a respectable widow with a young son. Society would accept you." "As a widow, yes," Georgiana replied. "But what happens when Edmund James grows old enough to ask questions I cannot answer? When he wants to know about his father's family, his father's estate? The lie would collapse, and then he would bear the consequences of my deception." Lord Richard had no answer to that, and so Georgiana remained in her beautiful prison, watching her son grow and trying to find meaning in a life that felt like punishment for the sin of having loved. September of 1818 brought the first truly cold weather of autumn. The leaves on the trees surrounding Hartfield Manor turned gold and red, and Georgiana bundled Edmund James against the chill for their daily walks. He was 3 now, old enough to ask questions and young enough to accept simple answers. "Mama," he said one afternoon as they walked along the lake path, "why do I not have a papa like Thomas in the village?" Georgiana's heart clenched. "Your papa is in heaven. He was a brave soldier who loved us very much." "Did you love him?" Edmund James asked with the directness of childhood. "More than anything," Georgiana replied honestly. "I loved him more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." "Then I will be brave like him," Edmund James declared, "and I will make you happy." "You already make me happy," Georgiana assured him, kissing the top of his golden head. "You are the best part of every day." But as they walked back toward the house, Georgiana felt the familiar weight of grief settle over her. Edmund had been gone nearly 4 years now. The pain had not lessened, had only become familiar, a constant companion she had learned to carry. She was so lost in her thoughts that she almost did not notice the horse approaching on the road that led to the manor. Visitors were rare, usually only tradespeople or the occasional message from her father. But this rider was different, moving with urgency, and as he drew closer, Georgiana felt her breath catch. There was something about the way he sat the horse, the breadth of his shoulders, the way he moved. Something impossible, something that made her heart begin to pound with a hope so painful it bordered on terror. The rider reached the gates and dismounted, and even from a distance, Georgiana could see he was tall, with blonde hair tied back and a beard that obscured much of his face. He wore civilian clothes, travel-worn and dusty, and he moved with a slight limp. He looked up toward the house, and even with the beard, even with the changes that time and hardship had carved into his features, Georgiana recognized his eyes. Edmund's eyes, that impossible, distinctive blue. The world tilted, and Georgiana felt herself sway. Mrs. Fletcher, who had followed her to the garden, caught her arm. "Miss Georgiana," Mrs. Fletcher said urgently. "Miss Georgiana, who is that man?" But Georgiana could not speak, could not breathe, could only stare as the impossible figure walked toward them. Edmund James had hidden behind her skirts, shy of strangers, but Georgiana barely noticed. The man stopped several feet away, and his voice, when he spoke, was hoarse with disuse and emotion. "Georgiana." She had not heard him speak her name in nearly 4 years. The sound of it, spoken in that voice she had given up hoping to hear again, broke something in her chest. "Edmund," she whispered, "you are dead. The War Office said you were dead." "I was a prisoner," he said, his voice rough. "French intelligence captured me after the battle. I was held for nearly 2 years, injured and isolated. When I finally escaped and made my way back to British lines, I had periods where I could not remember my own name, let alone how to find my way home. The head injury fractured my memory. It took months for my memories to return fully. And when they did, when I finally remembered you, I traveled as fast as I could." He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I wrote letters as soon as I could, sent them through military channels. I thought you would know I was alive, that I was coming back to you. But when I reached London last week and inquired for you, your father told me you had come here. He said you needed rest, that you had been ill." Lord Richard's fiction, Georgiana realized dimly. Her father's protective lie meant to explain her absence from society. "You are alive," Georgiana said, the words both statement and question, as though speaking them might make them real or might reveal this as a cruel dream. "You survived." "I survived," Edmund confirmed. "I survived because I remembered my promise to you. Because I remembered your face, your voice, the way you looked at me in the garden that last night. It kept me alive through imprisonment and injury and the long journey home." Then his eyes moved, drawn by movement, to the small figure half hidden behind Georgiana's skirts. Edmund James had been watching the stranger with his father's intelligent gaze, his golden head tilted in curiosity. Edmund's expression transformed from hope to shock to dawning comprehension in the space of heartbeats. He looked at the child, then at Georgiana, then back at the child. "That is why your father said you were ill," Edmund said slowly, his voice shaking. "That is why you came here. "Georgiana, who is that?" Georgiana felt tears streaming down her face as she reached down and drew her son forward gently. "This is Edmund James," she said. "He is 3 years old. He was born in March 1815. The mathematics were obvious. Edmund stared at the child who looked so much like him it could not be coincidence. And Georgiana watched 4 years of grief and isolation collapse in the face of impossible reality. "He is mine," Edmund said, the words barely audible. "Our son. From that night in the garden." "Yes," Georgiana whispered. "I did not know, could not have known until weeks after you had gone. I wrote to you, tried to tell you, but the letters were returned undelivered or went unanswered. And then the War Office declared you dead, and I thought my child would grow up knowing his father only through stories." Edmund took a step forward, then another, until he stood directly in front of them. He looked down at Edmund James with an expression Georgiana could not fully read. Wonder, grief, joy, and something that might have been fear all mixed together. "Hello," Edmund said softly to his son. "I am your father." Edmund James studied him with serious consideration. "But you are not a spirit, Papa. Mama said you were gone to God." Despite everything, Edmund laughed, the sound rough with emotion. "I was in France, which sometimes felt like the opposite of heaven. But I am here now, and I promise you I will never leave again." "Do you promise? Promise?" Edmund James asked, with the solemnity only a 3-year-old could muster. "Promise, promise," Edmund replied, his voice breaking. The boy, sensing the joy, celebrated the simple fact of belonging. Then he looked up at Georgiana, his eyes filled with questions and a kind of desperate hope. "I understand if you cannot forgive me for not coming sooner. I understand if 4 years of silence and the grief you must have endured have changed everything between us. But please, Georgiana, please tell me I have not lost you both completely. Tell me I have a chance to be part of this, to be the father our son deserves and the husband you once said you might consider." Georgiana felt the past 4 years crash over her like a wave. The fear when she discovered her pregnancy, the devastation of the War Office's letters, the shame of leaving London, the isolation of raising Edmund James alone, the constant gnawing grief that had colored every moment. She had mourned Edmund, had grieved for him so deeply that some part of her had died alongside him. And now he stood before her, alive and real, and asking for a second chance at the life they had almost had. "You were supposed to be dead," she said, her voice shaking. "I buried you in my heart. I built a life around your absence, and now you simply appear, as though 4 years of grief can be erased because you survived?" "No," Edmund said quickly. "No, I do not think grief can be erased. I do not think what you suffered can be undone. But I am asking if we can try anyway, if we can take what we almost had and build it into what we both deserve." Edmund James, with the intuition children sometimes possess, reached up and took Edmund's hand. "Mama cries sometimes," he said matter-of-factly. "She tries to hide it, but I hear her. Maybe if you stay, she will not cry anymore." The statement, delivered with such simple honesty, nearly broke Georgiana completely. She had tried so hard to be strong for her son, to shield him from the depth of her grief, and he had known all along. "I want to stay," Edmund said, his words directed at Edmund James, but his eyes on Georgiana. "More than anything, I want to stay. But that decision belongs to your mama." Georgiana looked at the man she had loved and lost, at the son they had created in a moment of love and desperation, at the impossible situation that somehow offered a second chance at the life she had given up hoping for. It would not be easy. 4 years had passed. They were different people now, shaped by war and grief and isolation. Edmund carried scars both visible and invisible, and Georgiana carried wounds that went deeper than her skin. But he was alive. Against all odds, against every reasonable expectation, he had survived and returned to her. "Stay," Georgiana said finally, the word both permission and plea. Stay, and we will see if we can build something from the pieces we both carry. The weeks that followed Edmund's return felt like walking through a dream that kept threatening to dissolve into waking. Georgiana set him up in the west wing of Hartfield Manor, granting him space while they navigated the strange reality of reunion. Mrs. Fletcher, once she recovered from the shock, threw herself into the logistics of extending hospitality to a man who was technically both guest and family. Edmund James, with the remarkable adaptability of childhood, attached himself to his father with enthusiasm that grew daily. He showed Edmund his collection of stones from the lake, his favorite trees for climbing, the secret spot where frogs gathered in the summer. And Edmund, with patience Georgiana found almost unbearable to witness, learned how to be a father to a child he had not known existed. "He is remarkable," Edmund told Georgiana one evening as they stood on the terrace, watching Edmund James chase fireflies across the lawn under Mrs. Fletcher's supervision. "Clever and kind, and so much like you." "He has your eyes," Georgiana replied, "and your hair. When he was born, I looked at him and saw you so clearly it was like a knife in my heart." Edmund was quiet for a moment, his hands gripping the terrace railing. "I am sorry," he said finally, "for all of it. For leaving you that night, for being captured, for the grief you carried alone." "You did not choose to be captured," Georgiana said. "You did not choose to be declared dead. These are circumstances, Edmund, not choices." "But I did choose to kiss you that night," Edmund replied. "I knew the risks, knew what could happen, and I did it anyway because I loved you and I thought I had time to make it right." "We both made that choice," Georgiana corrected gently. "I wanted you as much as you wanted me. And yes, the consequences fell more heavily on me because society punishes women for the same desires it celebrates in men. But I will not permit you to shoulder the blame for a decision we made together." Edmund turned to face her, his expression showing the conflict that had lived in his eyes since his return. "How do we move forward from here? I want to court you properly, to do what I should have done 4 years ago. But we already have a child together. The normal order of things is impossibly tangled." "Nothing about us has ever followed the normal order," Georgiana said with a faint smile. "Why start now?" Over the following weeks, they fell into a strange courtship that existed alongside parenthood. Edmund would join Georgiana and Edmund James for breakfast, then spend the morning playing with his son while Georgiana attended to correspondence and estate matters. In the afternoons, when Edmund James napped, Edmund and Georgiana would walk the gardens or sit in the library, talking as they had once talked in London, relearning each other across the chasm of 4 years and unimaginable experience. "Tell me about the imprisonment," Georgiana said one afternoon as they sat by the lake. "If you can bear to speak of it." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, watching the water. "I do not remember the actual capture clearly. I know there was a cavalry charge. I know I fell from my horse, but the details are confused. When I woke, I was in a French military prison with a head wound that had nearly killed me." He touched his temple, where a scar disappeared into his hairline. "They were soldiers, not savages, though their zeal made them ruthless custodians. But I was kept isolated, moved from place to place as the war's tides shifted. And the head injury fractured my memory. For months, I could barely remember my own name." "How did it return?" Georgiana asked. "Gradually," Edmund replied. "Little pieces at first. My mother's face, my brother's name, the fact that I was British and belonged to a regiment. But you, Georgiana, you came back to me in dreams before I could consciously remember you. I would wake with the sense that someone was waiting for me, someone I loved desperately, but I could not grasp who or why." Tears pricked Georgiana's eyes. "And when you finally did remember?" "It was like waking from drowning," Edmund said softly. "Suddenly there you were, complete and perfect in my memory. Your face in the museum, the debate at Almack's, the night in the garden." He turned to look at her. "The moment I fully remembered, I knew I had to escape. I had promised to return to you, and I would keep that promise or die trying. You could have died, Georgiana said, escaping from a military prison during wartime. I know, Edmund said, but living without trying to reach you felt like a slower death. So I took the risk, made it to Allied lines, and spent months convincing military bureaucracy that I was who I claimed to be. By the time I reached London and learned where you were, I had been traveling for months, following every rumor and lead until I found you here. Georgiana reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses that had not been there 4 years ago. The slight tremor that suggested his wounds went deeper than the visible scars. You found us, she said. That is what matters. Do you forgive me? Edmund asked, his voice raw, for leaving you to face everything alone? There is nothing to forgive, Georgiana replied. You did not choose to leave, and you came back as soon as you could. What happened is tragedy, Edmund, not betrayal. But forgiveness, Georgiana was learning, was more complicated than simple words. Part of her heart remained locked in the grief of those 4 years, in the terror and shame and isolation. Part of her wanted to rage at him for surviving when she had already mourned him, for disrupting the fragile peace she had built from the ruins of her former life. And yet part of her felt only overwhelming relief that he was alive, that Edmund James would know his father, that the future she had thought impossible might still be within reach. One evening in late October, as the first snow of winter dusted the mountains, Edmund requested a private conversation. They sat in the library, fire crackling in the hearth, the room warm and intimate. I need to speak with you about our situation, Edmund said, his tone serious. About what comes next. Georgiana set aside her book, giving him her full attention. I am listening. I love you, Edmund said simply. I have loved you since I heard you debate Lady Jersey about female autonomy. I loved you through imprisonment and memory loss and the long journey home. And I love you now, perhaps even more than before, because I understand how rare and precious what we had truly was. I love you as well, Georgiana replied quietly, though I confess I am still learning how to love you as someone living rather than as a memory. Edmund nodded. I understand, but I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer with complete honesty. Do you want to marry me? The directness of the question caught Georgiana off guard. Edmund, we have been reunited only 6 weeks. Yes, Edmund said, but we have a son together. We have already defied every convention of courtship and propriety. And I find I am tired of pretending that we are anything other than a family, already bound by love and shared experience. Georgiana felt her heart begin to race. You are proposing? I am asking, Edmund corrected gently. Because I remember what you said 4 years ago about independence, about not wanting marriage if it meant becoming less than yourself. And I meant what I said then. I want to marry you, Georgiana, but only if that is what you truly want. Only if you believe we can build a partnership that honors who you are. This is not about law, Georgiana. It is about proving that the autonomy you fight for need not exclude the deep satisfaction of a chosen, equal partnership. Georgiana stood and moved to the window, looking out over the darkening lake. I spent years arguing that women should not need marriage for security or respect, that we should be complete in ourselves. And then I found myself unmarried and pregnant, and I learned that all my principles provided no protection against society's judgment. Principles are not failures because they cannot protect us from injustice, Edmund said, coming to stand beside her. Your convictions were never wrong, Georgiana. The world that punishes women for the same behavior it celebrates in men, that world is wrong. But I am tired, Georgiana admitted. Tired of fighting alone. Weary of maintaining the solemn fiction of widowhood merely to secure my son's inheritance. Tired of living in beautiful isolation because the alternative is public shame. Then marry me, Edmund said, turning her gently to face him. Not because you need protection, but because we choose partnership. Marry me because I will spend every day of my life ensuring that you never feel diminished by our union. Marry me because our son deserves to have his family whole and his future secure. You make it sound simple, Georgiana said, tears threatening. It is simple, Edmund replied. The complications are what society imposes. But here, in this place, with just us and the truth of what we feel, it is remarkably simple. I love you, you love me. We have a son we both adore. All other concerns are but practical matters that may be managed in due course. Georgiana thought of Edmund James, of the boy who had his father's eyes and his mother's intensity. She thought of the conversations she and Edmund had shared over the past weeks, the easy partnership that had reformed despite the years and trauma. She thought of the future she could have if she said yes, a future where her son would not have to carry the shame of illegitimate birth, where she would not have to maintain the exhausting fiction of widowhood. And she thought of the girl she had been at 18, who had looked at marriage and seen only surrender, only diminishment, only the loss of everything she valued about herself. That girl had been right to fear those things. Most marriages of the ton were exactly what she had feared. But Edmund was not most men, and what he offered was not most marriages. Yes, she said, the word emerging stronger than she expected. Yes, I will marry you. Not because I must, not because society demands it, but because I choose the partnership you offer. I choose the joy of shared purpose. Edmund's expression transformed with joy so pure it made Georgiana's breath catch. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were something precious and fragile and infinitely valuable. I will prove to you every day that this was the right choice, he murmured against her hair. I will show you that marriage to me means freedom, not confinement. You already have, Georgiana replied, allowing herself to lean into his embrace. You showed me 4 years ago, and you have shown me again these past weeks. I trust you, Edmund, with my heart, with my future, with our son. They married 3 weeks later in the small stone chapel that served Hartfield Village. It was a quiet ceremony, attended only by Mrs. Fletcher, Dr. Weatherby, and a handful of locals who had shown Georgiana kindness during her years of isolation. Edmund James stood between his parents, solemn and important in his role as witness to their union. The vicar, an elderly man named Reverend Marcus Alderton, who had christened Edmund James 3 years earlier, conducted the ceremony with gentle dignity. He asked no uncomfortable questions about the timing or circumstances, merely blessed the union of 2 people who clearly loved each other and their child. I, Edmund Arthur Fairmont, take thee, Georgiana Elizabeth Darlington, to be my wedded wife, Edmund said, his voice steady and sure. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. Georgiana felt tears stream down her face as she repeated her own vows, knowing that these words, spoken now, transformed everything. Her son was no longer illegitimate. She was no longer living a lie. They were a family, whole and legitimate in the eyes of society and law. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Edmund kissed her gently, and Edmund James, understanding nothing of the legal import but sensing the joy, let out a whoop of triumph that set the entire small congregation to smiling. They signed the marriage register with Edmund James's name added as witness, establishing beyond any doubt his legitimacy now that his parents were wed. It was not the ceremony Georgiana had once imagined, back when she had been certain she would never marry. It was better, because it was built on truth and choice, and hard-won understanding of what love could mean. Lord Richard arrived the following week, having received word from Mrs. Fletcher that circumstances at Hartfield had changed dramatically. He embraced his son-in-law with genuine warmth and spent an afternoon playing with his grandson, who demonstrated his rock collection with pride. "I am relieved," Lord Richard told Georgiana and Edmund that evening as they sat in the library. "More relieved than I can express. When the War Office declared you dead, Edmund, I feared for my daughter's future. Not because I did not believe in her strength, but because I knew how society would judge her for circumstance beyond her control. Society's judgments are often cruel and rarely just," Edmund said quietly. "But we are fortunate to be here, far enough from London that we can build our life without constant scrutiny." "Will you stay here then?" Lord Richard asked. "Or return to London?" Edmund and Georgiana exchanged glances. They had discussed this question over the past weeks, weighing options and desires. "We will stay at Hartfield for now," Georgiana said, "at least until Edmund James is older. I have grown to love this place, despite everything it represented when I first arrived. And the distance from society gives us freedom to live as we choose." "Besides," Edmund added, "I find I have no great desire to return to military life or to the social demands of London. I would rather spend my time with my family and managing the properties we both now possess. Georgiana's intellect should not be wasted on morning calls and gossip." "You will let her manage the estates?" Lord Richard asked, genuine curiosity in his tone. "Of course," Edmund replied, as though the answer were obvious. "She is far better at such things than I am. My strength lies in practical management, in working with tenants and understanding land use. But Georgiana understands finance and law in ways I never will. Together, we make an excellent team." Lord Richard smiled, the expression carrying both pride and relief. "You are good for her," he said to Edmund. "You see her as she is, not as society insists she should be." "I fell in love with who she is," Edmund said simply. "I would be a fool to wish her different." The years that followed brought the life Georgiana had once thought impossible. She and Edmund managed their combined properties as true partners, with Georgiana handling correspondence and financial planning, while Edmund oversaw practical operations. They consulted each other on all major decisions, neither taking precedence, but both contributing their strengths. Edmund James grew into a bright, curious boy who showed his mother's love of learning and his father's physical courage. By the time he turned 6, he could read Latin, ride competently, and debate philosophical points with surprising sophistication. 2 more children followed. Eleanor Rose was born in 1820, named for Edmund's mother and Georgiana's love of gardens. Twin girls, Sarah Catherine and Margaret Ann, arrived in 1822, completing their family with the chaos and joy that only twins could bring. Georgiana occasionally traveled to London with Edmund, usually for business related to his military pension or their properties. She attended the odd social event, where her status as Captain Fairmont's widow-turned-wife generated some curiosity but less censure than she had feared. Time and marriage had rendered her respectable, though she knew the exact timing of her pregnancy with Edmund James would cause scandal if anyone calculated closely. But mostly, they lived their lives at Hartfield Manor, building a home that operated according to principles of genuine partnership rather than legal hierarchy. Edmund never made a major decision without consulting Georgiana. Georgiana managed significant portions of their finances. Their daughters grew up seeing a marriage of equals, while Edmund James understood that his mother's intellect was valued as highly as his father's physical courage. One spring afternoon in 1824, Georgiana stood in her mother's rose garden, watching Edmund teach their son how to properly fence. Eleanor was picking flowers under Mrs. Fletcher's supervision, while the twins napped in their nursery. The scene was peaceful, domestic, and far from the ballrooms of London, where Georgiana had once argued for female autonomy. Edmund finished the lesson and came to join her. "What are you thinking?" he asked, slipping an arm around her waist. "I am thinking about the girl I was at Almack's," Georgiana replied. "The one who was so certain marriage meant surrender, that love would diminish me." "Do you regret your convictions?" Edmund asked. "No," Georgiana said immediately. "I was right to be wary. Most marriages would have diminished me, Most men would have expected me to become less than I was. She turned to face him. But you showed me that marriage could mean something different. That partnership could exist between equals. That love did not have to mean loss of self. You showed me something as well, Edmund said softly. You showed me that courage exists in forms I had never considered. That standing firm in your convictions, that refusing to accept injustice even when it would be easier to submit, that is its own kind of bravery. Edmund James called for his father's attention, and Edmund kissed Georgiana's forehead before returning to their son. Georgiana watched them together, father and son, and felt contentment settle over her like a blessing. She had spent years afraid that marriage would be a cage. She had built her life around avoiding it, had defended female independence with passionate conviction, and she had been right to do so because the world did diminish women, did treat marriage as ownership rather than partnership, did punish female autonomy while celebrating male freedom. But she had also learned that principles could coexist with love, that fighting for justice did not require fighting alone, that the right partnership could amplify rather than diminish. Edmund James ran to her, breathless with excitement from his fencing lesson, and Georgiana caught him in a hug. He smelled of sunshine and grass, and his golden hair was tousled from exertion. "Mama," he said seriously, "Papa says when I am older, I can choose whether to be a soldier like him or something else entirely. He says it is my choice, not his." "Your papa is right," Georgiana replied, smoothing his hair. "Your life belongs to you, Edmund. You will make your own choices about what kind of man you wish to become." "Will I have to get married?" Edmund James asked with the bluntness of a 7-year-old. Georgiana and Edmund exchanged glances, and she saw the amusement in his eyes. "That will be your choice as well," Georgiana told her son. "Marriage should always be a choice, never an obligation. If you find someone who sees you clearly and loves you truly, someone who makes you better rather than smaller, then perhaps marriage will be right for you. But if you do not find that person, then there is no shame in remaining independent." "Did you find that person?" Edmund James asked, looking between his parents. "Yes," Georgiana said, reaching for Edmund's hand. "I found someone who showed me that love could mean freedom rather than confinement. Your father taught me that the right partnership makes both people stronger." Edmund James nodded, processing this with the seriousness he brought to all important matters. Then, with the quick shifts of childhood, he ran back to the garden to play with his sisters. Edmund pulled Georgiana into his arms, and she leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. 10 years had passed since that night in the garden when they had first kissed, since the moment of intimacy that had changed everything. 4 of those years had been marked by grief and separation and fear. But 6 had been marked by partnership and love and the steady building of a life that honored both of them. "I would make the same choice again," Georgiana said quietly, "even knowing everything that would follow, the fear, the shame, the isolation. I would choose that night in the garden again because it led to this." "As would I," Edmund replied, his arms tightening around her. "Every moment of suffering, every day of imprisonment, every painful step of the journey home, all of it was worth it for this." They stood together in the rose garden as afternoon light turned golden, surrounded by the life they had built from the broken pieces of circumstance and the stubborn insistence that love could be different, could be better, could be a partnership of equals. Georgiana Elizabeth Fairmont, formerly Darlington, had spent her youth arguing that women should not need marriage for completion or value. She still believed that, but she had also learned that the right marriage, built on respect and genuine partnership, did not complete a woman. It freed her to be more fully herself than she had ever been alone. Thank you so much for staying with Georgiana and Edmund until the end of their journey. If this story of partnership, courage, and love that transcends convention touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who believes in second chances and marriages built on equality. Your support helps us continue creating stories of historical romance that honor both the period and the timeless power of true partnership.